Good morning, everyone. This is Anne-Marie Kilkenny from Oliver White, and this is Anne-Marie Kilkenny from Oliver White, and together with my colleagues Liam Harrington and Stuart Harmon, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, The Buyer's Guide to Integrated Business Planning. We're coming at you from all around the world this morning, this afternoon, this evening, with Liam in America, myself in the UK, and Stuart in Australia. Just before we get started, I'd just like to walk through some of the housekeeping or technical details we need to make you aware of. If you would like to ask us a question relating to the presentation, you can do that either during the session or at the end. Please use the questions box in your control panel. And one of the things we'll be doing through the webinar is conducting some polls. You'll be able to see these on the presentation as we go through. We'd be very grateful for your participation. It makes it more interesting, I think, for everybody, but also helps us understand where you are with your process or in your thinking around the process. We'll let you know when to select your answer, and it's very simple, very straightforward. You just need to click on the screen. The other thing to say is the webinar is being recorded, and you'll be provided with details at the end of the session so you can see how you can view it afterwards. And there'll also be a white paper associated with this topic, which we'll be making available very shortly. Just finally, if you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact us via the Q&A box, and we'll try our best to help you. So with that said, we hope you enjoy the webinar, and thank you very much for joining us today and giving up your time.
Next.
So one of the, I guess, the key questions were why are we here, and particularly, I guess, the title of our webinar is a little bit of a provocative one. But I guess the issue for us is we have a fairly strong view about what integrated business planning is and what it should do for the organizations that use it. And one of the issues that we've seen, particularly recently, is an increasing view or presentation of views around integrated business planning that don't really represent the fundamental shift in thinking that we would expect to see when organizations are engaging in this process and in this change. For us, the process is something that's adapted across the entire organization, and yet time and time again, whether it's in conferences, in job adverts, things that we see across the internet, people are talking integrated business planning, but what they're selling, often what they're pitching, is really what is to us a traditional sales and operations planning process, very much supply chain oriented. And those of you on the line who are from the supply chain, please don't be offended. We do recognize the very significant contribution that the supply chain makes. And indeed, at the moment, it's an extremely busy area of activity because it is so important to the organization. But integrated business planning is not a process that is exclusively in the world of supply chain. And we just want to try and draw that out and really to get people thinking about what it really is and what it can really do for the business, so that when you're spending time working on this, you're really getting the value out from the effort that you're putting in. Just an interesting aside on this, Liam and I were having a conversation, and we both heard people talking about integrated business planning and saying, oh yes, I've been doing integrated business planning for 20 years, and we invented integrated business planning 10 years ago, so I'm not quite sure how they've managed that. Now, again, just to be clear, this is not about what you call the process. We really don't mind what you call the process. We have clients who don't call it sales and operations planning neither do they call it integrated business planning, and they have an excellent process. It really is about what you do with it. So just to start talking through what we would see the differences, what we would see the expectations of true integrated business planning, I'm going to hand over to Liam now to walk you through some of those key points.
Yeah, thanks, Anne-Marie. Yeah, so on the next slide, one of the things here is looking at who actually, for example, owns the business, or what are the key characteristics. So the first one here is actively owned by the head of the business. The wording here is deliberate, because actively means that they are active in the process. They use the process to run the business. If you look at our successful clients, that's the words they will use. If you speak to the CEO, they will say, "This is the process I use to run the business." I was talking with a group recently, the CEO, and I was talking to him about integrated business planning, and his response was, no, I don't want to learn about the supply chain. That's the supply chain, so I'm not interested. And when I asked him, why did he say that, his response was, well, he said, in our last company, that's exactly what that was, so I'm not interested in running the supply chain. So some of these thoughts are deeply ingrained. The second one is it is designed to fit your organization. The key here in terms of how you've got to think about the process is that the principles are what matter, exactly as Anne-Marie said, including what you call it. But your organization and your organization structure, and we'll talk a little bit about matrix a little bit later on. Many organizations now are relatively complex in terms of how they're structured. So you need to design it to fit that organization, but the key thing is getting all the decision rights correct within the structure, etc. The other thing is to think of this as a vehicle to deploy the strategy of the business. Yes, we do end up balancing supply demand. I mean, there'd be crazy to think that you don't, but it's not the purpose of the process. It's a byproduct of the process. It's not only to do the strategy, of course, it's to have a financial plan and a rolling financial plan. But if you think of it as something that is going to deploy the strategy within the organization, you're setting the ambition in the right direction. Another key aspect that I actually find to be quite the core of the process is the concept of top-down, bottom-up. So top-down is what the ambition for the business in terms of what we want to achieve, market share. We want to achieve, X amount of new products coming into the market. We want to achieve certain cost of goods, margins, etc. These are all top-down type aspirations. The bottom-up is actually crucially getting people in the business, as Colin said in his book, to face the brutal truth of reality. So the bottom-up is facing reality. And, we use another phrase, truth as you know it, which Stuart is going to talk about a little bit later on. So the key is having both those aspects of top-down and bottom-up. Far too often we see people reflecting bottom-up what the executives are looking for top-down. Excuse me, I would get a bit of coffee, wouldn't I? Right when I'm talking. So the focus of the process is very much then on closing those gaps between the top-down, bottom-up, and delivering growth to the business. Many of our clients talk about this delivering growth. One client where they were in an 8% decline, in fact, started achieving an 8% growth, which is a big swing as a result of this. And we've had a number of clients presenting at some of our events showing how, the business has either was flat or has declined and how growth has been achieved. And then another characteristic of this is full financial integration. one of the things that you often hear is a phrase called cash up, which is something that's done towards the end of a process. And I actually don't know where that came from. I first heard it about 16 or 17 years ago, or more, 20 years ago. And it came, I think, from a particular consultancy into a very large corporation. It's not a good process, because what you end up is talking volume in various aspects, only in various aspects of the process. And then at the very end, see the financial effect of that. To us, that's not financial integration. Financial integration would be at every step of the process. So just moving to the next slide for a moment, and then thinking in terms of a poll question. Who owns your S&OP process or IBP process? Is it the CEO or the managing director or the general manager? You know, because it depends on what business you're in and where you are in the structure. But is it the head of the business that owns it? Is it supply chain or operations or supply planning? Is it mainly an IT system? You know, that's what it mainly is. Do finance own it? How about commercial, sales and marketing? Do they own your process? So they're the questions. So select one that mainly fits your organization. You may feel that, oh, it's this and it's a little bit of that, but what's the main one of that?
And I guess just to add, if you don't have the process yet, but you're looking at it, who's driving that?
Yeah, good point.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, that's fantastic. 27%. It's the CEO. It'd be interesting if we go through and we have some other poll questions. It'd be interesting to see the relationship between that and the other outcomes. Finance, 4%. So a couple of people, I would guess, and commercial, sales and marketing on the process. That's an interesting one.
That's right.
65% supply chain operations, supply planning on the process. Wow, that's very large, isn't it, Anne-Marie? That surprises me. Well, I don't know the attendees, but it's surprising in terms of just how that has persisted.
Yeah, I guess that's an indication of the topic we're talking about. Is you know, historically, obviously, S&OP was a supply chain process, and the supply chain people very often are the ones who feel the pain when the business is not operating in an integrated fashion. So they're the ones who tend to want to do something about it. So in that sense, I guess it's understandable, but the number does still it is higher than I would have expected. So yeah, we'll see how that plays out in the subsequent questions, and hopefully that means we'll be giving people something to think about.
It just matter of interest, Stuart. I mean, is that something you find in Asia Pacific?
Yes, we definitely see. That traditional route in S&OP has been heavily supply chain owned, and supply chain often see themselves as the conscience of the organisation in terms of making sure we have robust planning processes. But that actually does then hinder the rest of the organisation coming into play as you look to evolve from S&OP into true integrated business planning.
Okay, on the next slide. So this is just a quote from a CEO of a consumer goods business, that, as it happens, Anne-Marie and I know, and this is about transformation. Now, for us, this is quite important, that integrated business planning has the ability, and it's not just, it's as a process, but of course, the crucial part is about altering the behaviors of the organization. So one of the reasons why we push very strongly that it should be your CEO who's driving the whole process is that it has this ability to transform the organization. By transforming the behaviors and gaining, if you like, a genuinely integrated process whereby it integrates the business and then changes the business in terms of its, profile, etc. So just as a backup to what we've been talking. So on the next slide, this is a little chart which we have a poll on it for you, but it's describing what the journey has been like. In fact, I could go back earlier than the sort of mid-1980s. Many of you may know that S&OP is a process that's developed by Oliver White organization in around 1982-83. Initially, the process was very focused on balancing supply demand and providing inventory control. Around the late 80s, what started to happen is the recognition that we needed finance in the tent, so to speak, rather than outside, criticizing the numbers. Or very often what was happening was that finance were attending reviews with the executive and then saying, oh, well, my numbers are different, etc. So the phrase actually, one set of numbers, came from the financial integration primarily. Then in the late 90s, in fact, it was around 96, product and portfolio management was integrated into the process. So what we found was that up to that, the demand review used to discuss product and new product coming in and products going out. But that was mainly from a technical point of view. But the people who actually drove the product and portfolio management, mostly, if you like, marketing, in some cases it might be an engineering type part of the organization or a technical or whatever. But the people who drove that were not fully integrated into the process. And what we weren't getting is very high performance coming out of products. So, of course, we're looking for 95% on-time delivery, for example, of projects and so on. So by having it as a separate process, it has been a fantastic value-generating piece of process. What many times the process discovers is that organizations are attempting to do more than they're capable of doing, or they're planning to do more than they're capable of doing. So they need to, if you like, pull back on that. Then what then started to happen in the 2000s, of course, that's not every company, because there are still some companies back in the mid-80s, but what started to happen in the 2000s was much more, if you like, around scenario planning and strategic deployment. So the companies who were better, the companies who had moved through, the late 90s, we're now into the 2000s, and then in around 2010, now much more around collaborative integrated business planning, so collaboration with major customers, with major suppliers, and so on. So a much more collaborative approach. So one of the things that Anne-Marie mentioned this earlier is that I was a while ago working in an organization, and there was a number of people there who were experts around integrated business planning, but all their conversation was around supply demand balancing. It was not what I would call a business process, it was a supply chain process. So surprisingly, there are people and therefore companies. Now, these people were helping this company implement integrated business planning, so there are people and companies who are still back in what we would term the mid-80s. They're at number one. If you have full financial integration but haven't yet moved on to, you know, having full product and portfolio management as a separate part of the process and so on, then you're at number two. And this is the poll, by the way. So then if you're not really using it for strategic deployment, then, but you have got product portfolio management, you're at three. If you are using it for strategic deployment and scenario planning, then number four. And then if you are in the if you like, the current frame, using it for collaboration with major customers and really using it to drive your place in the whole market, then you're in five. So that's what this poll is about. So in the next page, it sort of describes that poll a bit better, which is so in which decade is your process operating? So if you key in the number 1 to 5 that relates to the stage that you're in, each stage contains the cumulative, of course, to that point. So you can't say that you're in 5 if you don't have full financial integration, if that makes sense. So 1 is that you're still doing supply-demand balancing. 2 is that you do have financial integration. 3 is that now product and portfolio is fully integrated as a separate process, driven by, of course, by marketing and so on. 4 is that you're using it to deploy the strategy, and 5 is the collaboration, integrated business planning at a collaborative level. I always find this a tense moment.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the numbers here, so it's almost 80% of people have voted. So.
Okay. Okay. So that's interesting. Just coming up from number 4. So we have 17% who are using it for deployment of strategy. So that's good. And I suspect that there's an overlap with the set of people who were 27% earlier in terms of the CEO driving the process. Between 1 and 2, so in 1 we still have 25% of us doing supply-demand balancing, which I guess would also overlap with the set of the 65% who were the process run by supply chain. 2, we have full financial integration. And if we take it that 2, 3, and 4 all have full financial integration, that's a high
that's
number.
A good proportion. Yeah.
And then of the people who have full financial integration, 29% have product portfolio now as a separate process and integrated fully, which is it's also good to see. So some opportunity there for 54%, you know, the first 2 added together to really get product and portfolio and therefore marketing fully integrated into the process. And then an opportunity, of course, for most of the group to get into level 4. I guess at one point it'd be worthwhile thinking that we would run a webinar about 5, but what truly collaborative integrated business planning looks like.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So next slide. So I'm sort of guessing that many of you may have seen this slide before. This is our depiction of the process. It has 5 elements to it. One of the key things here is that in all the sort of boxes you see in the processes, financial appraisal is fully integrated in each one. So, for example, when we're talking about product management review, so that's a product management review would be run by the most senior person in marketing or whatever function is responsible for driving your portfolio. But obviously there are conversations in there. They may be looking at, is it a realistic plan to deliver, etc. But the other thing that they're looking at is the earnings roadmap that product plan will deliver. So in demand review, they're talking about things like margins that the plan will deliver. In supply, they're looking at cost of goods and the value of inventory, etc. So it's very important for us that finance is integrated in each of the steps. It's also important to us that product demand supply reviews are run by the executives responsible for those processes. Too often we see situation where, for example, a demand review, there's a demand manager who chairs the review. Now, some people can get confused over the term chair. We have 2 sort of roles that we sort of talk about in each of these reviews. So one is the person who's chairing the review. So that's the person who's making the decisions, making the call, if there are opposing views, and calling the decision, calling the consensus, if you like, of the review. And then we have another role, which is the facilitation of the process. So the facilitation of the process is, circulating the information, making sure we're running to the agenda, and so on. But not the person who speaks mostly. The expectation is that the people who speak are speaking to their ownership, the areas they own. So if I'm in a demand review and there's let's say for argument's sake, a country or a region input, then it's the country general manager or the regional general manager who'll be talking to their demand plan, not the demand manager. And the demand manager would not be chairing it, they would be facilitating it. The same with supply. It's not the supply planning manager, but it depends what you call them, but like the operations or the supply chain director or whatever that would be chairing it. And the same in product management, it's the marketing director or someone with that sort of title. So it's very critical for us that the right person is chairing the review. Otherwise, what can happen sometimes is that when you get to a management business review, nobody that's in the management business review has been involved in any of the processes, so they just sort of sit back in judgment of the numbers that come through. So this is why it's so important to have senior executive ownership of the process. Then we have a process then we call integrated reconciliation, a title I regret ever having as a working title, but that's what it was. It was originally a working title, and I sort of wish we came up with another one, because it sounds like, and I've heard people use this phrase, oh, integrated reconciliation is where we reconcile the different numbers and make sure that we have a reconciliation for the management business review. No, it's not. We're expecting one set of numbers out of demand. We're expecting one set of numbers out of product. We're expecting them to be integrated. We're expecting one set of numbers out of supply. We're expecting supply to be integrated with demand and product. Integrated reconciliation actually focuses on how the business is going to close the gap between the strategy, the business plan, and the performance goals, and the outputs from the other processes. So their main focus is on gap closing. They're not responsible for gap closing, but that's their main focus. So it's not about making sure the numbers are correct. It's about what we're going to do with regard to the outcome. So there is a reconciliation review, but it's at the end of the process. So integrated reconciliation is running all the time. Excuse me. And then we're going into the management business review, but what's critical in here is that we're making recommendations. So we're not just saying, here's all the problems. We're actually going in and saying, here's the business review and the recommendations. So in terms of the management business review, it should be no surprise that we're expecting, therefore, the management business review to have, like, the CEO or the managing director or the general manager chairing that management business review. And of course, their main focus is not in the short term, but on the longer term. I know, Stuart, is there anything you think would be good to add on that?
Well, I just think if we think about the purpose of the management business review, is to provide then direction to the organisation. We want to, approve the plans that we've reviewed and make sure that we're steering the organisation the direction that we want it to go to close any gaps that we've identified. So that the arrow coming from the management business review box is really important, because that's where how we provide that direction to the rest of our people in the organisation. Without that, a lot of the effort that goes into the integrated business planning process is actually wasted.
Okay, yeah, no good. All right. So on the next slide, many of you will be in organizations that are a little bit more complex than, a single market or a single supply point. We've a number of clients who are a bit more complex than that. So one, for example, they have 47 countries in the process, and each of those is a market. They've got about 50 plants around the world. In terms of products and product groups, they have 7 product groups. So, that's a complex organization. And I mean, one of the characteristics of integrated business planning is that it is a monthly process. So that is, everything that's going on happens on a monthly basis. It's got a monthly cadence, as some of my colleagues use the phrase. So this is an example in terms of what we refer to as a matrix organization. So it's where you have multiple markets and multiple supply points. And at the top, you can see there that we have a process we call integrated business optimization and corporate business review. So usually complex organizations do have, if you like, a corporate versus another style of process. But if you just sort of look through here, one of the characteristics of a matrix is that at no point in the structure does the whole process operate. So in this particular one, at global level, only 2 parts of the process operate. At business unit level, 4 parts of the process operate. At country level, 2 parts of the process operate. And then at the plant, only 1 part, of course, which is the supply plan, the inputs to the supply plan. So in this example here, in the countries, the demand review is chaired by the country general manager, not by sales and marketing. In a smaller company, that was operating the whole process, let's say in a tighter geographical construct, then you would have maybe the sales and marketing director, or if they were separate, you might have joint ownership, or certainly have them both there. But in this structure, it's the countries actually who operate the process. So that's the general manager, and then usually the product review would be, well, in this particular case, it's marketing, in the countries, and then at the business unit level, where they also have a marketing, they're running the product review of the marketing. So I'm sure many of you are complex, and this is just an insight into what that looks like. We find a lot of companies who are complex that they're trying to run the process at every level. So at the country level, they're trying to have a product demand, supply, integrated reconciliation management, business review process. And then at the business unit level, they're trying to run all of those again. And so they have these swim lanes, and every part of the process trying to run. And you just go, that's crazy. You know, you don't need to do that. It doesn't make any sense to do that. So designing the matrix is a crucial part of how you go about it. But it takes a little bit of time to do that, like a couple of days to figure that out. That's our unit of measure, by the way, is days, not, you know, that would take 5 months or 6 months. But that would take a few days.
It's a critical piece of work, though, isn't it? And it's a really good investment of the time. And the organisations who get this right, you know, if you're thinking about integrated business planning, supporting transformation, then the opportunity here, I mean, it's a challenging piece of work, and some of the more complex organisations we've worked with, everybody has a headache, you know, at the end of the process. But the opportunity for really clarifying accountabilities, which we find particularly in larger organisations is often slightly fuzzy, really clarifying the accountabilities, really clarifying the decision rights, and crucially, you know, pushing empowerment down the organisation, pushing decision making to the lowest sensible level. This can really free up the people at the top of the organisation to think more strategically, to spend more time thinking and talking about the longer term. But for the rest of the organisation to feel really connected to the decision-making process in the business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so next slide.
Yeah, so this really is just reinforcing the purpose of integrated business planning. And again, the organizations who think about integrated business planning in this way, the ambition that they set for themselves, they're the ones who really deliver tremendous results, tremendous performance improvement, and true transformation through the business. And I think it's again, sometimes we have to spend a bit of time with organizations in the early stages of the journey to set out what does this mean. But if you're thinking about a process that's looking for the top down and the bottom up to meet together and identify where the issues are, where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, then having the clarity around the top down is really essential. So making sure that everybody understands what those key strategic goals are, and then spending the time in the process talking about how do we reach those strategic goals, how do we resource the plans that are needed to deliver against that. Sorry, have we got a technical issue? I'm just getting some feedback that you're getting feedback. We okay?
We're good.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. So, you know, if you think about your process, then the value add in the process is spending time talking about how do we close those gaps, how do we exploit those opportunities out into the longer term. What we do see sometimes in organizations is actually the conversation is more about, are we going to deliver this quarter, and an absolute fixation on the budget. You know, are we going to hit the end of year targets? And the problem that gives is that then everybody starts, you know, behaving like kids who don't really understand the rules of the game. Everyone's chasing the ball, and nobody's really thinking about what are the consequences for the long term to enable us to really deliver against the strategic goals of the business. So if we think about your strategic objectives, and if you think about what you talk about in your process, be it an integrated business planning process or an S&OP process or anything else that you might call it, then we're just interested in understanding, and I guess an opportunity for you to think about where is it you're spending your time. So if you just go to the next slide. So is your process really about delivering the strategy? And the test of that is, what do you really talk about? So I'm asking here, not what you would like the process to do, but a bit of, I guess, honest self-diagnosis about what you think where you think you're really spending the time. And hopefully just thinking about this a little bit will also allow you to think about why that might be, what's working well, and where you might need to have some reflection and make some improvement. So would you say you spend most of your time in your IBP or S&OP process talking about how we're going to deliver growth in line with the strategy out over our 24 to 36 month planning horizon? And if so, the answer will be number one. If you spend most of your time talking about, are we going to hit this year's budget? And so here we are in March, you'll have a 9-month horizon, and as you get further through the year, there's more and more discussion about how we're going to deliver the end of the year goal. In that case, you'd be number 2. If most of the conversation is about, will we hit this year's output target, then you'd be number 3. And if the focus is, what are we going to do this quarter, then the answer would be number 4. So please go ahead and
Oh.
okay, so we have half of you spending most of your time talking about this year's budget, and almost a quarter of you talking just about this year. So clearly there's some opportunity for improvement around that, and I guess the thing to be thinking about is the problem that you have when you're focusing on hitting the quarter end or the year end is you're going to make decisions based on a short-term view to hit a specific target that could have consequences on your ability to deliver the long-term goals of the organization. So I guess some reflection about what's driving that. Very often it's leadership behaviors, we acknowledge that, and those would need to change to really get the process to be delivering what it should be delivering. And what could you be doing to really change and challenge that? Because our experience is the quality of the decision making will suffer if we are overly focused on those fixed year-end periods or quarter-end periods. Okay, so thank you for that. So moving on, and definitely to link to this. So integrated business planning, we tried to find a name that actually described exactly what the process is doing. It is integrating all of the key plans in the business in line with the strategy. And so that means we have to have a process that is externally focused, it is externally driven. We are looking outside at what's happening with our customers, with our markets, with our competitors, and that is driving the key decisions that we're making in our process. So we're looking for an integrated business planning process that is truly demand driven. And we're also looking for rolling plans related to the conversation we were just having about what can happen when we fix ourselves to the end of the year. So the first part of this relates to what Liam mentioned earlier on about making sure that the product portfolio activity or the portfolio of services that we offer is included fully into our integrated process. So again, the organizations who are very successful at this, they take that strategic direction, and that drives through into the planning around the portfolio and what that's going to deliver for the business. You know, my experience in the practitioner in the early 90s, we talked about product, but it was very much on an operational level. What's going to phase in and phase out, and when will that happen, so we can plan the operations around that. The organizations who are using this now, they have a fully integrated product portfolio step in their integrated business planning process that is owned by the head of marketing or the head of business development, or the head of technology, depending on the type of industry that they're in. And they use this to drive incremental growth in the business. I was with a client just a couple of weeks ago where the work that they have done around this piece, really looking at how do we get to true incremental growth, has transformed both their top and bottom line. I mean, just significant, huge growth in the business as a result of focus in this area. And then, of course, we want to make sure that that portfolio is deliverable, so that the connection between marketing or business development and sales, so the translation of the plans from the demand picture from the product picture, into the demand picture, and translating that into activity plans with marketing and sales and making sure that's fully integrated. Again, critical part of the process. You know, the demand plan is not just about what's the forecast for volume so we can plan the factory. 3 weeks ago, I was with a head of sales in a consumer goods company, and he told me he absolutely uses the demand part of their integrated business planning process to drive and deliver growth in his market. Those were the words that he used, and they've been very successful at this because they've got strong integration between the activity around the portfolio development and the activity around marketing plans and the link with how that's translated through to sales and account planning. And all of that is used in the integrated business planning process. That's what they use their process for. A byproduct of that is some good information that the supply chain guys can use to plan what they're going to buy and make and ship. So really critical part of, and this is as Liam referenced earlier on, the difference between a supply chain planning process and a business planning process. This is about planning the business. So again, just jumping to the next slide. So another poll, we've got 2 questions for you here. So these are 2 separate entries that we'd like you to make, please. So the first one is, would you say your product portfolio, now you may not have physical products, but the portfolio of your service offering is truly integrated to your process? So by that we would mean you would have a product portfolio step in your process that would be owned by the right person, so the head of marketing, the head of technology, and the focus of that would be on how do we drive incremental revenue and margin over the longer term horizon. So this is just a binary yes or no. And then the second question is, who really owns your demand plan? So if we were to say, put your hand up if this is your plan, who would do that? Would it be the head of sales? Would it be a demand manager who would be based within the sales organization, so directly reporting into the sales organization, or would it be a demand manager or planner in the supply chain organization? So two separate questions to answer there, please. Okay, so that's clear. And honestly, people, a huge opportunity for you. This, in terms of using the process to drive top and bottom line growth. Okay, so next one.
Sure.
Who owns the demand plan?
I guess if it's marketing, then that own it, then they could click on head of sales, can't they? If it's the head of marketing.
Yes, yes, that's a good clarification. Wow.
Well, that's somewhat back in line, though. It'd be interesting if it's an overlapping set with the 65% of who owns the process.
Yeah, I guess that would suggest that. Okay. Another webinar just in that topic, I guess, but we'll move on to it and the financial piece.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So if we have a look at the next slide. So as Liam mentioned earlier, a couple of the key characteristics of integrated business planning, this idea of the top down and the bottom up, and also gap closing. So if you think about top down, the strategy, setting of the business plan, typically these days we're seeing organizations doing multi-year business plans. It's not just a one-year annual budget. The leading organizations are looking a little bit further out and putting some detail behind that plan. And actually what we see is a lot of effort goes into this top-down planning. Normally there's lots of documented assumptions, and gives us a really good baseline to compare against. What we do through integrated business planning is every month we create a bottom-up view, and a critical element of that is that we use this concept of truth as we know it. So what we mean by that is we're really honestly bringing what we believe is the most likely outcome to the table through the review of the plans in the process that Liam outlined earlier, and we've got some evidence or logic that enables us to believe that this latest bottom-up view is going to be delivered. Now, if there's a gap between the top-down and the bottom-up, that's really the essence of IBPs. Understanding, is there a gap? Seeing that gap early enough so we can do something about it. So if we think about understanding the gap, the question we need to ask is what's different about the assumptions that we had that underpinned our top-down plan, so our strategic plan and business plan, and the assumptions that we now have that underpin the latest bottom-up plan that we've created in the latest monthly cycle of integrated business planning. And we need to understand whether what we're seeing is a trend or whether the assumption change is a one-off. And once we understand that gap, then the challenge for us is to put plans in place to close the gap. And that's really the power of integrated business planning when you get this right. You spot the gap early enough, and why we talk about a rolling 24 to 36 month view. If I identify a gap far enough out in the future, I've got lots of time to put some gap closing plans in place. For those organisations where you're just focusing on the annual plan, typically what we see is, or certainly I see with a lot of my clients, is we identify we've got a gap too late. Because we don't use truth as we know it when we do the bottom up. We say no, can't possibly be a gap that big, and by the time we realise there's the gap, we've run out of time. So we have to do some fairly unpalatable things, as Anne-Marie mentioned, to bring everything back in line, if we can in fact do that. And there's a risk that we actually impact the subsequent financial year and our longer term objectives. So if we move to the next slide. One of the tools that we have in terms of understanding how we're going to close gaps is this idea of opportunities and vulnerabilities, and it's worthwhile just explaining what we mean by this. So we've got on this diagram here or slide, we've got our top-down view. That's the dotted line at the top. We've got our bottom-up view, which is the solid line. Now, in our bottom-up view, there may be some elements of that plan where there's some risk associated, and so if we think there's a risk, we should call out, and it's a significant risk, and we've got some evidence to say there's a risk, then we'd often look to call that out as a vulnerability. And if we call out a vulnerability, we want to ensure that we've got a plan to mitigate against that vulnerability. So this is something that's part of our bottom-up plan. But there's some risk associated with it. As a leadership team, as a leader of an organisation, I want to know that I've got a plan in place to take care of that. So I say I can sleep at night if I understand my vulnerabilities, and I've got mitigation plans. In terms of then bridging the gap between the bottom-up plan and the top-down, you can use this concept of opportunities. So an opportunity is something that's actually we're not certain enough about this to put it in our bottom-up plan yet. So it's not yet the most likely outcome. We've got some work to do to make this happen. But by identifying opportunities, we can seek to close that gap. Now, the big risk for organisations here is they come up with lots of ideas, and they say we've got lots of ideas, we should be able to close the gap. What we're looking for is something a lot more solid than that. We're looking for actual plans documented. We're looking for some evidence that the organisation has the capability of executing these plans in sufficient time so the gap will actually be closed. This isn't about identifying lumps of white space that magically are going to close gaps. This is about having solid gap closing actions. And so key thing to remember here is opportunities are over and above the current bottom-up plan. We have to do some work to turn an opportunity into the most likely outcome. And that's going to move us then towards that achievement of the top-down plan. If we move to the next slide, it's just worthwhile talking about the budgeting process. So one of the key characteristics of integrated business planning and organisations that apply this process well is that they're able to use the rolling 24 to 36 month planning process to start creating their annual plans. So that because we've got financial planning, they're fully integrated in the process, as Liam explained. Because we've got a rolling plan, we're seeing things early. If we're identifying gaps, we can start to close those gaps early. Because we're looking at the plan multiple times over that planning horizon, there really should be no surprises. We understand the assumptions that underpin the plan. And for instance, I've got numerous clients, when we first start working with them, I say, when do you start your budgeting process or your annual planning process? For most organisations, it's somewhere between 3 months before the start of the new financial year. In some organisations, it might be as early as 6 or 7 months. If we've been using a rolling 24-month plan in an IBP process, and we start our annual planning or budgeting process 6 months before the start of the new financial year, then we would have looked at that financial year that's coming towards us, would have looked at that 6 times in total. So there really should be no surprises, and yet lots of time and energy gets spent on budgeting in organisations, and very little of that is actually value added to your customers. So integrated business planning, when you do it well, gives you a really good mechanism for reducing that budgeting workload, reducing the surprises, and telling you early whether we've got any gaps to that top-down view. In particular, the strategic element that Anne-Marie talked about. And the leading organisations have actually eliminated the annual budgeting process. They've transitioned to a rolling financial planning process. So as we think about how this works in your organisation, if we move to the next slide, our next poll question for you. Yes, Liam.
Sure. Sorry, I was just going to say just before going on that is that, looking at the previous poll in terms of how far people are looking out, is that I think it's about a quarter of the people listening do look out 24, 36 months. Whereas the rest are looking at the either a myopic view of the year in terms of this year's budget, or even shorter term. The other thing we talked a lot about was financial integration earlier, and getting finance into the process. And so if you marry those things together, the big prize of looking further out and getting finance into the process, as you said, is the opportunity to eliminate the annual budgeting process, all the work that they do to reinvent what next year looks like. So in the group we have listening, there's a large proportion of them have that opportunity. Just sort of
good call out. Yeah, thanks, Liam. And we really see that as a benefit. Organisations that we help get this integrated business planning process in place, they regularly cite that as a lot of the stress involved in budgeting. I always ask the question, who enjoys the budgeting process? And even the finance people don't put their hand up. It's typically a lot of hard work, a lot of drudge, and it bounces backwards and forwards to between the group or shareholders to get approved. If you move to the rolling, and as Liam says, you've got the finance team as part of the integrated business planning process, you take away all that waste, all that non-value added activity. So this poll question, what we'd like you to do is think about, so for your organisation, is greater than 90% of your annual budget derived from your IBP process or your current S&OP process? If that is the case, so the bulk of the work comes from your rolling planning process, then hit 1 for yes. If that's not the case, hit 2 for no. If you're in the position where you only use a rolling financial plan and you're gap closing to targets, then hit 3. Yeah, it's interesting seeing the numbers come in. I love these live polls. So given 87% in, so and to be honest, given the responses to the poll questions earlier, how this is coming out isn't a surprise. So 63% of the responses you said no, you're not deriving greater than 90% of your annual budget from your IBP process. Great to see that a number of you are, and also that some of the organisations who are participating, you're saying you're using rolling financial plan and your gap closing to target. So well done. That's despite being very effective, it's still not unfortunately that common. But for those of you who've answered no, again, the great thing is you've got some opportunity there. because there is a more effective way of committing the organisation to the annual plan. So if we move to the next screen, we might ask Liam to wrap us up for the webinar.
As you sort of listen to this, I'm wondering whether it has increased your ambition for the process, because we're not sure where everybody is. Obviously, some of you are well down the road. Using rolling financial planning is a mature operating, which is fantastic. However, there's still 65% roughly of the audience who are quite far back in the process, which is probably why you're listening to this webinar, in terms of it's the supply chain who are operating your process and own it. You don't have rolling financial plans. You don't have even financial plans that help you do the budget. Your focus is relatively short term, this year and so on. So the key issue is, why are you listening in? Are you listening in to drive a real ambition in terms of change? Is that what you really want to do? And what we mean by real ambition is the ability to transform your organization. So we're actually got a poll attached to this, but so many people we come across, and I think it's disappointing, they implement integrated business planning, but they don't do much with it. It's going back to the slide that Anne-Marie showed, I hadn't actually seen the cartoon before, but I have sent it to a couple of clients, because we were talking about with a client, in fact, yesterday, about some of the executives who want to make change happen, in the sense of we want to implement a new process, but they don't want anything to change. They want to do things the way they've done it for the last 25 years, indeed. So many organizations, it's surprising, they spend money, they raise the hopes of people further down the organization. They change nothing. All they've got now is a new system. I don't mean computer system necessarily, but a system of operating, and not much. The second fishbowl here is the business improvement. So is the ambition to improve business? Is it well, I'm not sure, I guess, what people would be looking at. If your ambition is to reduce inventory and improve customer service, you won't achieve that in a sustainable manner by having that as your only ambition, to be frank. And that's very often, I think, why supply chain people think that they can drive the process, because they've got those goals that they want to achieve. But it's very, very difficult to sustain, because you lose people's interest as soon as you start getting, improved service. You're not meeting the goals of sales or marketing or indeed the CEO, because their goals are not met by just those two things. They would consider like customer service to be an annoyance if it's low, but it's a more hygiene factor than anything else. So I guess I'm sort of implying that business improvement, you can get business improvement integrated. Well, obviously by integrated business planning, we've talked about a lot of improvement, but a lot of the improvement we talk about is because people have gone for three, which is the transformation. Genuinely making a difference, genuinely challenging people in terms of, is this a new way that they want to work, and not firefight, not operating in silos, but actually genuinely integrating the aspects of the business and driving the organization in an integrated way towards the strategy and the goals of the business. And it is truly transformational. And I guess one of the things that, Anne-Marie, I think you and I had this a while ago with a client where they said, well, we don't want, transformation. People would be afraid of that. What can we not tell them that we're going to do transformation?
Yes. And transformation by stealth.
Yeah, by stealth. Yeah. But I know that sounds a little bit paradoxical, but people are afraid of promising, maybe it could be, or are indeed genuinely afraid of transformation itself. But that is the opportunity. So, part of this is about trying to understand your ambition. So one is in terms of implementation, but not much change, if you like, but get the process in and operating. Is that where you're heading? Is that where you want to go? 2 is business improvement, and 3 is transformation. Do you want to use it to transform the business and the way it operates? So that's the poll here.
That's great to see the level of ambition.
Sorry, Anne-Marie?
That's great to see the level of ambition coming through.
Absolutely. I think that's a high number. No one is admitting to implementing, but keeping things going the same as we have for 25 years. I think we probably sort of either talk them out of that, Anne-Marie, or shame them that they wouldn't put that down. But, the issue, though, is not so much that you have that ambition, but that you recognize all the things we've covered as we've gone through in terms of the CEO owning it. It's not owned by supply chain. You need the 24-month horizon. All of those things are what gives you transformation.
Mm.
And and I'm sure it's true that 80% of you are looking for transformation, but that means you need to implement those things, the full financial integration, be thinking in those terms, and not just be satisfied with supply-demand balancing. And our experience is that companies genuinely need help in doing all of this. It's not something that you can just do on your own without some guidance. But be careful who you choose in terms of guidance, because if the words are integrated business planning, but the word count is actually more supply-demand balancing, then that's part of the issue you're going to get.
Absolutely, that's the fake news.
That's the fake news. If we could pick up on some of the questions. Okay. So if there are some questions that people would like to ask, that'd be great.
I think we may be out of time.
Okay. Oh, so we are well out of time. I'll leave it to you, Anne-Marie, to.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for the time and participating in those polls. Some interesting mix of answers there, and hopefully we've given you some things to think about and consider. And to Liam's point, just remember, the questions you need to ask and the things you need to focus on if you truly want to deliver that ambition you've just articulated. So thanks again, and as we said, the webinar will be available as a recording, and we wish you all every success in your future endeavours. Thank you.